Hello everyone and welcome to the November Microsoft Patch Tuesday webcast. I'm extremely excited to have you join me today to go over the very serious and very urgent vulnerabilities that Microsoft fixed yesterday. My name is Rob Brown and I'm Head of Customer Success for Syxsense. And over the last 10 years, we've been deploying fixes for vulnerabilities, patches, and vulnerability fixes to our customers all around the world. And some of the techniques and strategies I'm going to cover today have allowed us to do that, to target the most critical vulnerabilities that you should be paying most attention to. So welcome to everyone for joining today. First, we're going to cover some news. And some of this is very important news. When I was putting this together with the team, we were trying to bring in this new version of our webcast series, things that are very relevant to the Microsoft Patch Tuesday release. And if you're familiar with our webcast series, we've combined Microsoft and third-party and sometimes Mac OS and sometimes Linux as well. And what we've decided to do is to separate these completely into very small bite-size webcasts throughout the month. So this will be specifically focused on Microsoft, and there will be one for Linux and one for Mac and one for third party as well. So what is very important about the first piece of news here, where Microsoft has decided not to release preview updates in December. Well, preview updates is a pre-release of what's coming in the next month. So in December, if they don't release those preview updates, they don't have the exposure to the beta patches for the whole of December that will effectively make it in January. So if the preview releases do not get released in December, there's less testing taking place. So that's very important. So in January, and as I will recommend next month, in January, extra testing must be done to make sure that anything that hasn't been observed already by Microsoft or by customers participating in the preview release don't negatively impact your users. Now, potentially because of the US election, or maybe because we're coming into the Christmas period, there were no Adobe updates this month within the Microsoft stack, but there still is an awful lot of Adobe updates available directly from the vendor. So if you're using Windows Update, WSUS, SCCM, you won't actually have the Adobe within those platforms. If you're patching outside of the Microsoft stack, such as using Syxsense, then all of those updates will be available for immediate deployment inside your console. We also finally have 22H2 for Windows 10. It's finally been released, and it is a very exciting release. We haven't heard any major issues with it so far. On the downside, 21H1 does reach end of support in December 2022, and that's just 2 months away. So because the life cycle of patching is so intimately connected with feature updates, if your feature update becomes out of date, patching no longer is available for that operating system. So it is so serious, in fact, that feature updates should be a part of your patching strategy. And although Microsoft is extending the lifespan of their feature updates to 30 months, that can come around really, really quickly. So for the next 2 months, if you have any devices on 21H1 or before earlier versions that are not long-term branch, they must be immediately upgraded so that you can start patching them from January going forward. Now, yesterday we had not a huge release, but we had a very interesting release with many, many critical vulnerabilities being fixed. In total, we had 64 Microsoft updates. Of course, that doesn't include any Adobe. 11 were critical and 53 were marked important. But interesting, We also had a very large number of Windows 7 fixes in this month. So if you're still using Windows 7 because of the ESU extension, you will have 4 critical updates and 17 important updates to roll out. Similar for Windows 2008. That is actually getting an additional year. So whereas Windows 7, you had 3 years of additional life support, life cycle, for 2008, you get an additional year. So you have 4 years. So this month, you've got 24 fixes, slightly more than Windows 7, 6 critical, 18 important. Also, we've got a very important number of vulnerabilities to address that have what's called a jump point. Now, a jump point is where if you follow the CVSS scoring system, you'll know this as called a scope. We call it a jump point. Basically, a jump point is where you can expose a vulnerability, exploit it, and from within the technology that you exploited, you can hop out into another technology. So an example is you could maybe come in via a service, hop out of the service into a command area, and you could start writing arbitrary code, completely separate to the original exposed vulnerability. It is very, very serious. And the reason why we highlight jump points is because this is actually one of the reasons that the SolarWinds became so pertinent when it was released, because they came in through one vulnerability that was much lower severity, and then began their weaponized attack using other technology, and it made it very, very difficult to track. So there are 5 of these that we would highly recommend that are immediately remediated. We've also got 6 weaponized. The largest number that I can remember for a few years now. A weaponized vulnerability means that it's actively being exploited. And it's really interesting how that information is gathered. Most of the time, it's gathered by the antivirus and cybersecurity organizations around the world, where they're seeing attacks taking place and they're looking at how those attacks took place. You also have the vendor themselves. They are detecting the vulnerabilities being used in an active exploit. 6 vulnerabilities are currently weaponized, and that is a very serious thing. Now, it may be that some of those vulnerabilities impact software that you may have on very few devices, but I certainly want to be an IT manager that said, oh, I didn't think that we would be targeted because we have such few devices that could be impacted by those weaponized threats. So anything that's weaponized should really be looked at very seriously, and where you have those public facing on the internet, they should be urgently remediated. And we also have one public aware. And what's interesting about the one public aware is that it is also weaponized. So you kind of have a double whammy approach from both sides. Public aware means the exact method to expose the vulnerability is on the internet. It could be on GitHub, it could be on the dark web, it could also be published on certain websites. Now, just because you have a public aware or that precise blueprint to expose, it doesn't mean it always does. In fact, there are many public aware vulnerabilities that never do get weaponized simply because they're so difficult to weaponize. However, I also wouldn't want to be an IT manager that said that I didn't take that seriously. So that public aware vulnerability should be remediated. It's actually my top pick for today. Now, how are we going to prioritize Patch Tuesday? So from a managed services perspective, we can't just roll out every update to every device, to every customer all over the world. Networks can't handle such a load, and in fact, you often have regions with different kinds of networks. So you have to be very economical in the selection process. You want to target the very most serious vulnerabilities first before then going to the next ones and the next ones and the next ones. And that's very easy to do if you have a strategy to prioritize those updates. And at Syxsense, we use 6 factors to help us decide which vulnerability should go first, which vulnerability should go last. So we use the vendor severity as the first source of truth. The vendor often comes with a severity, and we take that into consideration. And that's usually critical, high, or important, medium, and low. Sometimes there's an NA as well. Then we have the independent CVSS score. Now, the independent CVSS score is assigned by a governing body. If the vendor issues a score, the governing body re-verifies that the score is correct, and it's from 10 to 0, 10 being the worst, 0 being the least. Now, if you combine the two, you have a much more accurate way of identifying the industry versus vendor in terms of accuracy. And that is why it's very important to have multiple sources of truth when it comes to how you're going to prioritize your patching, because it matters in a weaponized attack. The vendor, often Google, for example, will release an update of NA severity, but the CVSS score will be reassigned 10. If you're not choosing the right severities, you often can miss very, very important patches that resolve vulnerabilities that pose the greatest risk to your environment. Next, we've got the state of the vulnerability. And as I just mentioned, we have the weaponized and the public aware. Weaponized meaning that it's actively being exploited, and public aware meaning that the precise blueprint to expose is published somewhere on the internet. If you have a weaponized threat and or a public aware threat, it can sometimes be more important than severity alone. So you now have 4 factors to use to calculate the risk that you're not prepared to take when it comes to patching. Now, we have some balance, because we can't just say everything that's critical and weaponized and public aware should be remediated. Sometimes that's not feasible. So we have a balance called a countermeasure, and a countermeasure is either a mitigation or a workaround. The mitigation might indicate from the vendor or from the industry that a next generation antivirus is protecting you. Therefore, you don't need to deploy the binary down your network. Or you might have a mitigation. So you might be able to effectively change group policy, or you might be able to stop a service. And that means you don't need to roll out the update as well. These should be taken into consideration, because that can effectively resolve any vulnerability caused by the bug from the vendor. And then lastly, it's your exposure. And the example I gave before is, why would you prioritize super urgently a patch that is only on a few devices in a 30,000 device network if 99% of your devices are vulnerable for a high severity vulnerability that isn't yet weaponized? The simple math would suggest that you have a much bigger footprint of devices that could be exposed to the other vulnerability. Therefore, at the same time, targeting the weaponized also go for the other vulnerabilities that are the highest exposed in your environment. And that's very easy to do with Syxsense, because we actually calculate these for you automatically in your console. So that's how we're going to prioritize them for our customers. How are you going to do it? Well, we're going to provide that data for you. And if you're a regular, you'll know that we don't actually put them here into the presentation. We actually do publish everything to our website the day before the Patch Tuesday webcast. So if you head over to syxsense.com, on our website, you will find over here along the top, we've got some resources. Now, under the resources, we've got our news, which is our industry news around vulnerabilities and patches and best practices and strategies. We've got our vulnerability database, specifically helping anyone to remediate vulnerabilities that are Windows-based and CVE recognized. So if you don't know exactly how to remediate a vulnerability, say an operating system configuration vulnerability or a user password policy, then you can go here, put in the CVE number, and we'll tell you exactly how to do it. There is examples of PowerShell and other registry keys that can be deployed by your toolset, such as Syxsense, to go ahead and resolve those vulnerabilities. Most importantly, we've got our Patch Tuesday holding page where we have all of our Patch Tuesday articles available for you to view straight away. Now, if you do have any questions about Patch Tuesday or strategy, go ahead and use the chat in the bottom corner and talk to one of our experts, and they will put you in contact with somebody that can help you with a strategy. Even if you're not a Syxsense customer, it is very important that whatever tool you're using, you can use the resources on our site to help you remediate your vulnerabilities. So if you head over to the Patch Tuesday page, I just so happen to have this one here. This is what was published yesterday. Now, as I mentioned before, we've got 64 fixes in this month, which is kind of similar to we've had the last several months now, with 15 critical, 1 public aware, and 6 weaponized threats. And pretty much everything was patched, from Microsoft Windows to Azure, Exchange, Office, Visual Studio, SharePoint, everything, including Windows BitLocker. Now, what is interesting is that we had one weaponized vulnerability that happens to impact the print spooler. Now, if you cast your mind back to the beginning of the year, you'll remember the print nightmare. The print nightmare was a vulnerability that was fixed in a patch, and that patch needed to be patched, and that patch needed to be patched. 3 updates came out in a very short period of time to fix issues with printing. Now, I totally understand that you're going to expedite the print spooler patch to your environment. However, please, careful testing should be conducted. Make sure you've got examples of your devices, whether they are virtualized or whether they are laptop or desktop. Make sure that you have enough of those devices tested to make sure that you're not going to impact your users. It is very important that you delay the deployment until full testing has been performed. Okay, now I have selected 3 vulnerabilities of importance, starting with this one, CVE 2022-41091. Now, this one is a Windows mark of the web security feature bypass vulnerability. Now, Windows mark of the web is something I never knew before. I knew it as something different. This is the flag that is placed on files when you download them from the internet. So if you go and download something from the internet, security products on your machine, such as antivirus, will actually place a flag. We'll be looking for a flag on these files that indicate that maybe they came from an unsecure source. Now, this particular vulnerability, if an attacker can craft a malicious file, it would evade that mark of the web defense. So it could effectively change the state of this flag and allow security features such as protected view in Microsoft Office from allowing that to run. Well, what if the file that you had open had something embedded inside it that did something very naughty to your computer? So very, very important. This is the one that is both public aware and weaponized and needs to be remediated as soon as possible. The vendor only marks this as important, and it only has a CVSS of 5.4, which is only halfway really, but it jumps up because it's weaponized and it's public aware, and it also impacts pretty much every Windows operating system. So the exposure in your environment is massive. If we look down at our risk calculator, the attack vector is over any network, including the internet. Attack complexity is low, no privileges whatsoever. It does require the user to run something, hence the sending of a file, and luckily it doesn't have a jump point. But that is a very serious vulnerability that should be scanned in your environment and deployed as urgently as possible. Next, CVE 2022-41040. This is a Microsoft Exchange server elevation of privilege vulnerability, and we've seen quite a few of these over the last few months. Now, the disclosed vulnerability allows a remote user to perform an SSRF attack. Now, successful exploitation of this vulnerability may allow that remote attacker to execute arbitrary code on the target system. So if they could send this attack, they could potentially exploit one of the devices, and then they've got the ability to run anything they want within the code of that vulnerability. Very, very serious. Its vendor severity is critical. Its CVSS is 8.8, so it's very, very high, and it is weaponized. There is no countermeasure for this vulnerability. You must deploy the update. Now, if you are a Syxsense customer and you do not see this vulnerability in your console, please use the chat function and we will send you this to your console. But please, it is an Exchange update, and careful testing must be conducted prior to deployment of this patch. It can, if we look at the SIX-score risk, we see that it can be attacked over, it can be exploited over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction, and luckily for us, it doesn't have a jump point. And finally, of my 3 picks, I'm going to choose that print spooler vulnerability. That is 2022-41073. Now, this is a boundary error within the Windows print spooler, and an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain system privileges on that device. System privileges is like the next level up from administrator, so they pretty much can do whatever they like to the device, and it impacts everything from Windows 7 all the way to Windows 11. So whatever the original code was for the print spooler, it's still in the operating system from Windows 7 all the way up, and it is being actively exploited. It has a vendor severity of important, a CVSS score of 7.8, and it is weaponized, and there is no countermeasure. Now, if we look at the risk, it's interesting that this is lower risk to the other 2, but because of the exposure, it's as serious. Its attack vector is local, so you need local access to the device on a local LAN. The attack complexity is low, privileges are low, there's no interaction, and there is no jump point. That is the really good news. Not as easy to exploit, but nonetheless just as important as the others. Now, what we've done now is we've placed all of the details of all of those factors for you down here. So if you're using Syxsense or another tool, just go ahead and use this CVE number here on the left-hand side. Go ahead and search for that in your toolset, in your patch management toolset. If you have a large number of devices that require this CVE, go ahead and deploy them in this order, should you so wish. If we look down here, though, there's some interesting vulnerabilities that are more likely to be exploited. And Microsoft has recently started to place more details into their patches that we are publishing here for you, such as this one. This is a very interesting one, this Microsoft ODBC driver remote code execution vulnerability. It is important, marked as a CVSS score 8.8. Now, an attacker could exploit the vulnerability by tricking an authenticated user into attempting to connect to a malicious SQL server via ODBC, which could result in a server receiving a malicious network packet, and this could allow the attacker to execute arbitrary code on the device. Highly recommended that these ones are targeted. We have the columns over on the right side, which is our highest priority. But if you continue down this page, you'll notice some things actually do become very, very serious, although not our top picks, but just as serious, like this one. The net logon RPC elevation of privilege vulnerability. It has a severity of important with a CVSS score of 8.1. An attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain administrative privileges. So that's one step just below system, but just as important. And if we continue down, you'll notice where there are vulnerabilities with the jump point. So wherever you see a jump point like this one, the Windows Advanced Local Procedure Call, ALPC, this one has a jump point, which means that they could go in through this vulnerability, move inside Windows, and potentially you will find it very, very difficult to find them, especially when such a move often includes things like breadcrumbs, which is where they leave an account or they leave something active so that if the original vulnerability is remediated, they now have a second chance to get back into your network. And in fact, that is exactly what we learned they did during the SolarWinds. Now, if you are using Syxsense, go ahead and pop in the CVE reference here into the toolset, and you can start remediating them immediately. If you're not a Syxsense customer and you would like to start a demo, go ahead and use the button in the top corner, or if you have any questions, talk to our techies down here and they'll be on hand to help you understand if your patching strategy is working or whether or not you would like to try using Syxsense. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are so excited to relaunch this new webcast series. It's a slightly different format. If you have any questions, please send them over to us. We'd love to answer them privately, and this is something that we've learned from over 2 years of these webcasts, is that everyone has lots of questions, and it's so important that if you need any help, please reach out to us. We do have a team on hand to help anyone. Until next time, I hope you have found this really useful, and happy patching.